You are not deaf, but you have not truly heard, not the way a soul hears when eternity speaks, not the way a heart quivers when silence isn't empty but holy, because the voice of God is not always a sound. It comes like a wind that passes through the ribs of your grief, like a weight that rests not on your shoulders, but on your conscience, like the ache you feel at midnight when everything around you is quiet. But somehow, everything inside you is loud, and yet, most people never notice. They say God is silent, but perhaps they've mistaken silence for stillness, or stillness for absence. You see, we have trained ourselves to listen for thunder. We want burning bushes and parting seas. We want heaven to shout when it was always meant to whisper. But God does not perform for the proud. He speaks in the kind of voice you must kneel to hear. That's why his voice is missed, not because it's not present, but because it's not loud enough to compete with ego. It is the sound of conscience in the hour of temptation, the pang in your chest when you walk away from someone who needed you, the warmth in your gut when you forgive someone who doesn't deserve it. It is not what you hear with ears, but what you feel in truth. But how many of us are still enough to feel? How many are humble enough to hear? You cannot hear the voice of God if you are too busy justifying your own, and that is the tragedy of our age, that we drown in information and starve for revelation, that we are fluent in opinions but deaf to wisdom. We have filled every moment with noise, not realizing that heaven has always spoken in silence. The voice of God does not come when you command. It comes when you surrender. It finds you in the ache between two decisions, not after you've made up your mind. It rests in the humility of the one who says, I don't know what is right, but I want to. Do you know what makes God speak? Not volume, not virtue, but vulnerability. The voice of God is not given to the one who is certain, but to the one who is open. There are people who have read every book on spirituality, but have never once heard the whisper that says, this is the way, walk in it, because they were not listening with the soul. They were listening to confirm what they already believed. But God is not an echo chamber. He is the voice that breaks your argument so you can become someone new. The Israelites stood before Mount Sinai and trembled at the thunder. But when Elijah waited on the mountain, God was not in the wind, nor the earthquake, nor the fire, but in the still, small voice, the stillness that makes no sense, the silence that somehow burns with meaning. You do not find this voice in the spotlight. You find it in the cave, in the wilderness, in the empty places where no one is watching and no one is applauding. The voice of God does not flatter your ego, it flattens it. Because God does not speak to impress you. He speaks to transform you, and transformation rarely feels like comfort. It feels like truth. It feels like that moment you realize you were wrong, but instead of feeling ashamed, you feel free. It's when the mask falls off and no one's watching. And for the first time, you're glad, because the person underneath was who God loved all along. But how easily we miss this. How quickly we trade eternal whispers for temporary noise. We chase answers like addicts, demanding signs, chasing wonders, when all along the wonder was not what God would do, but that he would still speak at all. Why does he speak so gently? Because only love can hear it, and love is never forced. You do not hear the voice of God by being religious. You hear it by being real. You hear it when you finally stop pretending. When you admit the loneliness, when you confess the doubt, when you say, God, if you are there, I'm listening, not with perfect faith, but with honest longing, because the voice of God is not for the perfect. It is for the poor in spirit, the ones who know they need help. And when you finally reach that point, not when you're strong, but when you're surrendered, he doesn't scold. He doesn't shame. He says your name, not loudly, not forcefully, but in the kind of way that makes your soul remember that it was his all along. That is the voice we are missing, not because it's not speaking, but because we have forgotten how to listen, not with ears, but with reverence, not with control, but with surrender, and maybe, just maybe, that's where your healing begins. It's a strange thing, how much we beg for God to speak and how quickly we run when He actually does, not with words of condemnation, but with that unnerving clarity that pierces your pretending. We say we want answers, but what we often want is permission to keep living as we are, to be affirmed in our illusions, to feel divine without becoming divine. But the voice of God does not coddle your false self. It exposes it, not to destroy you, but to resurrect the self that was buried beneath survival. Have you noticed? When the prodigal son returned, the father did not give a lecture, he gave a name: Son. There are moments in life when the voice of God does not say anything new. He simply says who you are, not the name you gave yourself out of fear, not the role the world handed you, not the mask you crafted to earn love, but your true name, the one He whispered into you before the world began. And when you hear that name, not with your ears but with your eternity, you weep, not because you're sad, but because for the first time you've remembered that your soul is older than your pain, that your calling is deeper than your trauma, that your identity is not a wound, it is a witness. This is the power of the voice of God. It doesn't shout above the chaos, it waits beneath it. It does not compete with your noise, it calls you out of it. But who will go that deep? Who will leave behind the comfort of opinions to enter the discomfort of revelation? Because when God speaks, He doesn't just inform, He convicts. He calls, He compels. He does not give you a to-do list. He gives you a cross, and that is why most people miss Him, because we do not want a God who transforms. We want one who agrees, but the true voice of God is not an echo of your preferences. It is the contradiction that saves you. The surgeon's scalpel is not gentle because it is weak. It is gentle because it knows exactly where to cut, and so is the voice of God. He cuts away the lie that says you are unlovable. He carves out the pride that made you hard. He speaks not to decorate your life, but to deliver it. You'll know it's God speaking when the words don't just inspire you. They interrupt you, when they strip you down to nothing, and somehow you still feel safe. That's the paradox of grace. It wounds before it heals. It confronts before it comforts. It calls you by name, but it is the kind of call that requires response. You can't stay the same when you've truly heard it. You either follow it deeper or you run from it faster, but you cannot ignore it, because it doesn't haunt you. It haunts the false self you've built, and it won't stop until that self dies, not to punish you, but to make space for your resurrection. The voice of God is not for the hardened. It is for the broken open, for the child who was told they were too much, for the addict who believes they're too far gone, for the cynic who stopped praying because it never seemed to matter, for the proud who are secretly afraid that if they stop performing, there will be nothing left to love. That's who hears the whisper, not the one who has mastered the scripture, but the one who's desperate enough to say, Lord, even your silence is better than the world's applause. Because sometimes the voice of God doesn't tell you what to do. It simply holds you where you are. And in that stillness, you begin to see the difference between noise and guidance. You begin to discern this anxiety, not His voice. This pressure to prove, not His voice. This need to win arguments, be noticed, be admired, not His voice, but this peace that makes no sense, this urge to forgive even when it hurts, this invitation to take the lower seat at the table, that is Him, always Him. He is not in the flashiest option. He is in the faithful one. He is not in the fast lane. He is in the narrow one, and sometimes He is simply in the waiting, not speaking, not solving, just sitting beside you like a friend who doesn't need to fill the silence, because His presence is the message, and if you stay long enough in that silence, you will hear it, not as thunder, not as fire, but as the quiet truth that holds your entire being. You are mine. And when that happens, when the voice finally reaches you, you realize it was never about finding God's voice. It was about becoming still enough to know He never stopped speaking. But stillness is not easy in a world that rewards noise. We are taught to chase clarity, not surrender, to seek signs, not trust, to demand answers, not dwell in mystery. And so we miss Him, not because He's hidden, but because we are too hurried. To see what only the slow and the sacred can perceive, you cannot hear the voice of God in a rush. It will not compete with your deadlines. It will not perform in your schedule. It waits, patient as eternity, quiet as truth, present as breath, and that is why so few ever hear it. Not because they aren't loved, they are, but because love never shouts where listening must begin. In the soul, to hear God is to unlearn the world, to step back from everything that flatters your intellect but starves your spirit, to let go of the need to be impressive, right, successful, seen. You must come as a child. You must come as one poor in spirit. You must come as one who dares to admit, I no longer trust my own voice above His. That is the beginning of wisdom, because when you finally tire of hearing yourself, when your own voice becomes too familiar to be sacred, too proud to be clean, you realize the ache you've been calling loneliness was never loneliness. It was longing, and longing is holy, because longing is how heaven keeps its grip on you. The voice of God speaks through. Longing more than it ever speaks through certainty. When you long to love rightly. When you long to be clean again. When you long to stop pretending. When you long to be held by something, someone you cannot see, but feel moving toward you like a tide that's always been yours. That is Him. He's been speaking in your ache, not to torment you, but to awaken you, to say, the world can't satisfy you, because you were never made to be satisfied by the world. And that is the divine scandal, that God doesn't silence your ache. He speaks through it. He doesn't take away the longing. He deepens it, so that every temporary thing becomes what it was always meant to be, a signpost, not a destination. The voice of God is not always an instruction. Sometimes it's a wound that tells you, you're not home yet. It is the homesickness of the soul. It is the shepherd's voice calling you from a far country. And if you listen closely, you'll hear it even in your tears, especially in your tears, because God does not waste sorrow. He speaks through it. He sanctifies it. He turns it into soil for revelation. Have you ever wept, not from pain, but because you finally saw how far you'd wandered? Have you ever felt the heartbreak of your own forgetfulness? That moment, when memory returns not to shame you, but to reintroduce you to your soul, that is His voice, a whisper behind your shoulder. This is the way. Walk in it. But you must be brave enough to stop walking in circles, to stop feeding what numbs you, to stop chasing applause that costs you your clarity. The voice of God will not flatter your addiction to noise. It will ask you to put down your phone, turn off your opinions, and come back to the quiet, because the sacred things are never shouted. They are revealed in stillness, and stillness is not passivity. It is posture. It is a soul on its knees, not out of defeat but out of recognition. The one who made me is speaking, not to entertain, not to impress, but to restore, because the voice of God is not like the voices you've known. It is not manipulative. It is not impatient. It is not cruel. It is the voice of the father who waits at the edge of the road every morning, scanning the horizon for the shadow of his child returning. And when he sees you, even from far off, he runs. That run is a voice too. That embrace is a gospel. That robe, that ring, that feast, none of it came with a lecture. None of it required performance. Just return. God doesn't need your eloquence. He doesn't need your resume. He needs your presence, because He is not after your perfection. He is after your heart, and the heart only hears what the ego is willing to die for. So if you want to hear the voice of God, do not ask for signs, ask for surrender. Do not demand clarity, ask for courage. Do not chase prophetic words if you are unwilling to obey the quiet conviction He already gave you. The voice of God does not skip steps. It builds slowly, like dawn. It reveals the world one shade at a time, until all at once you realize the light has been rising the whole time, and so has He, always speaking, always waiting, always loving, even when you weren't listening. And if you truly want to hear Him now, you must come as you are. Not as a polished prayer, not as a curated version of yourself for heaven's approval, but raw, ruined even, with the trembling honesty of one who says, I have nowhere else to go. That is the soil where His voice begins to grow, because God does not speak to those who think they have it all together. He speaks to those who know they don't. The Pharisee stood tall and thanked God that he wasn't like other men. The tax collector beat his chest and could barely lift his eyes. Only one left justified, and it was not the one who spoke the most eloquent prayer. It was the one who simply told the truth. You cannot hear the voice of God if you are still lying to yourself, and you cannot receive divine comfort while clinging to self-righteous armor. The whisper of God does not pass through pride. It passes through poverty, poverty of spirit, poverty of pretense, poverty of ego. And only then, when you are empty enough to be filled, can His voice begin to echo in your bones, not just as a word, but as a way. Because the voice of God doesn't only speak to your situation, it speaks to your becoming. It says, you are not your past. You are not what they did to you. You are not the name the world gave you when it didn't understand your ache. You are mine, and when the soul hears that, truly hears it, it begins to rise, not in arrogance, but in quiet, grounded wonder. You realize you don't need to be spectacular. You just need to be surrendered. You don't need to be successful in the world's eyes. You just need to be faithful in His. You don't need every answer. You just need enough light for the next step. This is how the voice of God works. It does not show you the entire path. It simply holds out a hand and says, follow me. And that is the great dividing line between the curious and the called, between those who admire Jesus and those who leave everything to follow Him. Because once you've heard His voice, you cannot unhear it. You cannot go back to your old life and pretend you never tasted something eternal. You may wander. You may fall. You may forget, but something in you will always remember. There is a voice that knows me deeper than I know myself, and still calls me beloved. That is the voice we were made for, not the voice of shame, not the voice of culture, not the voice of comparison, but the voice that spoke the universe into being and still chooses to speak to you, to you. Do you grasp the wonder of that? That the same breath that hovered over the waters, the same voice that said, let there be light, the same word that became flesh, now whispers into your silence with the same power that raised the dead. But you must make room for it. God's voice will not wrestle your attention. It waits for invitation. It arrives when distraction dies. It flourishes when idolatry is confessed. It strengthens when obedience begins. This is why so many miss it, not because they are evil, but because they are distracted. They are busy building lives they secretly hope God will bless, instead of asking God what kind of life He desires them to build. They are afraid that if they stop to listen, they'll have to change. And they will, but only because He loves you too much to leave you in the illusion. He will disrupt what is fake. He will dismantle what is hollow. He will undo what is not rooted in Him. And this undoing, this holy unraveling, it will sound like loss. It will feel like emptiness. It may even resemble failure. But it is, in truth, the voice of God calling you back to your original design, back to your first love. back to the stillness where your name still echoes in the halls of heaven. And when you stand there, not as a performer, not as a consumer of spiritual content, but as a soul, naked and unashamed, you will hear it again. That voice, not condemning, not controlling, but creating, saying not, do more, but come closer, because in the end, the voice of God is not found in complexity. It is found in communion, not in performance, but in presence. And when you realize that, you will stop chasing every voice that promises a shortcut. You will stop confusing volume with truth. You will stop settling for counterfeit intimacy. You will begin to hear it even in the quietest corners of your life. The whisper in your conscience, the nudge in your discomfort, the love in your longing, and you will know He has been speaking all along. And when that knowing settles in, when you no longer strain to hear but begin to recognize, when His voice feels less like thunder and more like home, you realize the miracle was never in hearing it once, but in learning to walk with it daily, because the voice of God is not an event. It's a relationship. It is not a sermon you visit on Sundays, but a presence that whispers on Wednesdays, in grocery lines, in arguments, in the silence of early mornings when your chest is heavy and your heart is afraid. It speaks not only to guide you, but to be with you. It does not say, go over there. It says, come walk with me. And it is here in the daily walking that most people fall away, because we want divine flashes, not divine footsteps. We want breakthroughs, not the breaking. We want to be moved, not made new. But His voice does not come to entertain. It comes to rebuild, stone by stone, word by word. A temple is formed in your soul, where heaven can dwell, not because you're worthy, but because you've said yes. Yes to the stillness, yes to the pruning, yes to the deeper love that demands more than belief. It demands surrender, and once you've said yes, even with trembling lips you begin to hear Him in places you once thought silent. The bird song at dawn becomes a hymn. The ache in your chest becomes a parable. The face of the stranger becomes an invitation. The breath in your lungs becomes a prayer. You hear Him in the I'm sorry. You hear Him in the letting go. You hear Him in the choice to love when it costs you your pride. And suddenly the voice of God isn't missing. It's everywhere, in the grace you extend, in the truth you finally tell, in the forgiveness you thought you could never give, in the stillness you once feared, in the love you never thought you deserved, because the voice of God is not always a voice. It is sometimes a presence, so real, so weighty, you find yourself weeping, not because you're sad, but because you're finally known. No pretending, no performance, just you and Him. And it is in that kind of knowing, that kind of nearness, that your life begins to shift. You stop chasing your worth. You start living from it. You stop fearing the silence. You begin waiting for it. You stop needing signs. You become one. Because the voice of God doesn't just guide you. It changes what you desire. It softens your judgment. It breaks your pride. It heals your wounds, not by erasing them, but by using them to carry mercy to someone else. And this quiet revolution of the soul, is how the kingdom comes. Not through spectacles, but through surrender. Not in the loud places, but in the low. Not in the ones the world deems holy, but in the ones the world has forgotten. And when you finally live in tune with His voice, when you stop striving to impress Him and start walking with Him, you'll discover something unexpected. His voice never sounded like a command. It always sounded like a calling, not to do more, but to come closer. And that closeness, that's what you were made for. Not religion, not rigid perfection, not being good enough. But this, a life whispered into existence by love, called home by grace, and restored by the quiet voice that always knew your name. So if you've missed His voice, it's not because you're too far gone. It's because He's drawing you closer than you dared believe. And maybe, just maybe, the ache you feel right now isn't emptiness. It's invitation. So don't run. Don't rush. Breathe. Listen. Because the whisper hasn't stopped. And neither has he. He's still calling, still loving, still waiting, not above you, not beyond you, but beside you, within you, for you. And maybe all this time, the silence wasn't absence. It was presence in disguise.